And that was when Margaret White came out of her back door and saw us. For a minute, she just googled as if she couldn't believe it. Then she opened her mouth and whooped. That's the ugliest sound I have ever heard in my life. It was like the noise a bull alligator would make in a swamp. She just whooped. Rage. Complete insane rage. Her face just went as red as the side of a fire truck, and she curled her hands into fists and whooped at the sky. She was shaking all over. I thought she was having a stroke. Her face was all scrunched up, and it was a gurgle's face. There are very few King characters who are as memorable as Margaret White, even if she was just part of his first novel. And she's also one of the most misremembered because people tend to mix the movie's version with the book one and add a good amount of flanderization in the process, turning her into a caricature of an abusive mother. But the thing is that when they do that, when we make Margaret into a caricature, we ignore the most interesting parts of her character. Now, don't get me wrong, Margaret White is a horrible person, and I will repeat this a couple of times during the episode. Anyone who did even a tenth of what she did to Carrie should have their children taken away and be thrown into jail immediately. But as a fictional character, Margaret White is fascinating and remembered because of her dimension, not just because of the shrill crazy woman that most tiny glimpses of the movie make her to be. I'm AdalisaZ, and for a bit of a change of pace here on Stephen King Mondays, let's analyze Margaret White and her very toxic form of motherhood. This is not a video about King's archetypes, although Margaret fits quite nicely in the abusive mother's role, which I will talk about soon. In fact, that is what inspired me to do this specific video, because while I could have mentioned Margaret in the video of the abusive mother, it would have been either a small mention or fill the whole video because she is the most iconic evil mother of King's canon, although not the only one nor the evilest. Also, more importantly, Margaret is not just an abusive mother. She's also a religious fanatic, the very first one we get to meet in King's work, and the one who makes everyone else, yes, even Miss Let's Kill a Child to appease God Carmody in the Mist, look tame in comparison. And yet, there is one underlying characteristic that Margaret has that no other abusive mother nor religious fanatic has. One that is easily forgotten, mostly because the movies tend to do away with it, and while the musical took it and made it the central point of her characterization, it's a bit problematic when we consider real-life implications, so it's not really common to talk about it. But since I love overanalyzing King's books, we are going to talk about it. Because you see, despite the abuse, despite the multiple attempts to murder her, Margaret White loved Carrie. This is why I said at the beginning that it's important to remember that this doesn't absolve her, not justifies what she does to Carrie, just as there is no justification for abuse, period, in real life. The fact that Margaret loved her daughter doesn't change the fact that she ruined Carrie's life, that she made her own daughter miserable and was one of the main reasons why the tragedy happened. What it does is making all of this even more tragic. And the comment about how obsession, in this case religious obsession, can destroy even the most powerful of loves. I need to remind you that also, no matter what, Carrie is a book written in a way in which we have very unreliable narrators. And you can check that in my first video of this series where I talked about precisely that, and how every adaptation of the story grabs a different point of view from those narrators to make their own version of the Black Prom, so I won't go again about it here, but this means that every different narrator has their own view of Margaret and their lifestyle, and the way in which these views are presented to us color how we see Margaret. Again, this is not to say that there is a possible reading in which Margaret is not the most horrible person in the universe that should have never, ever be left alone with a baby. But it helps us to see more how she works as a villain and why is she so memorable even after all these years, and even after we have seen in real life that there are very, very bad mothers, some of which are even worse than Margaret. This means, the unreliable narrators, that no one knows the full truth. We know a little bit more than those inside the story because there are a few sections that are either from Carrie or Margaret's point of view, of course. This is how we know that Margaret loved Carrie, by the way, and we will talk more about that later. But how other people saw them is very important because that is how we form our first impression of Margaret, and that colors everything else. The very first mention we have for Margaret is in page 8 of the book, when we see a newspaper that informs us about a rain of stones over the White House, when we understand that Margaret is a widow and has a 3-year-old daughter. We also know that she wasn't reached for comments on the rain of stones over her house. From then on, she's not mentioned again until her first clinical book on the Carrie White incident, The Shadow Exploded, where we learn that Carrie was born on September 21st, King's own birthday, by the way, and that the author sees the birth as bizarre. This is our first clue that Margaret may have been a victim of some sort of abuse too, a subject that is very recurrent in King's books, how the cycle of abuse and violence goes for generations. Because we learned that Margaret didn't know that she was pregnant until the moment that she gave birth. She was alone, her husband died in February of the same year, and being friendless due to her intense fundamentalist beliefs, she had no one to look upon her until the actual moment of birth, where her screams were so loud that people actually called the police. Although they called them 5 hours after the screams began, emphasizing a lot more how the isolation that Margaret lived in was before the birth of his daughter, how alone Margaret really was. We still haven't met the woman herself. This is important. And we already know that no one liked her. And thus, we understand that we shouldn't like her either, because she was weird as hell. Do I sound a little sympathetic towards Margaret? Yeah, I do. Because if we are feeling sympathetic to Carrie, who, no matter how justified, killed at least 100 innocent people during her mental background, the novel also forces us to see a bit deeper into Margaret's actions once we get to a second reading. Although again, no, Margaret was evil. By the time Carrie was born, Margaret was beyond saving, to be honest. Completely isolated from her family and her community, she was stuck with her own version of the Bible, one that was far crueler than most people think about, obsessed with the parts about punishment more than about salvation. She had some friends she wrote to, but in general she was alone. Not only that, her education was, as I said, so lacking that she didn't even know she was pregnant. Instead, she believed that she was dying of womb cancer because she deserved it to, according to her. As I said, the problem with Margaret is that everything is sin. When we finally meet the woman herself, it's through Carrie's eyes. Mama, as she calls her, arrives at home from work after the moment when Carrie became a woman, and she's listening to hymns on the radio. She's not a pretty woman, nor is she described as one. Mama was a very big woman, and she always wore a hat. Lately, her legs had begun to swell, and her feet always seemed on the point of overflowing her shoes. She wore a black cloth coat with a black fur collar. Her eyes were blue, and magnified behind rimless bifocals. She always carried a large satchel purse, and in it was her change purse, her billfold, both black, a large King James Bible, also black, with her name stamped on the front in gold, and a stack of tracts secured with a rubber band. The tracks were usually orange and smartly printed. And yes, I realize I should have drawn Margaret in the book version and not the movie version. Oops, not to solve for the next time I visit Carrie with you guys. We also learned that she was originally a Baptist, but that she and her husband Ralph left the church convinced that the Baptists were working for the Antichrist. Of course. And then we see firsthand how she treats Carrie, hitting her and blaming her for the sin of getting her first period, claiming that if Carrie hadn't sinned somehow, she wouldn't have gotten it. That is why we need sex education, people. This is, of course, crushing. Any sympathy we might have had for Margaret, given what we have learned before of her isolation, disappears the second that she raises a hand against her daughter for something that was natural. Sure, this is also when Carrie resolves to try and go against her for the first time, and when we learn that, more than loving Mama, Carrie fears her and hates her because now, being 16, she has realized that the very cause of her ignorance about the world and her isolation from her peers is Mama and her God, which is also an interesting thing to note for later analysis. Carrie is never half as devout as Margaret is, even if she was taught by Margaret her whole life. She doesn't believe what her Mama does, because all that her Mama taught her was to fear. It is only here, in the book, after we have learned to fear Margaret because she manages to overpower Carrie even if Carrie has budding powers, when King quotes the fictional book The Shadow Exploded in order to give us more insight into her past. But again, by now we are positioned to hate Margaret. This is not the same thing that happens with Carrie, where we met her at her most vulnerable, naked and suffering abuse, because we met Margaret at the highest point of her authority, as Carrie tries to fight her but ends up locked in the closet anyway. This is where we learn that up until she was 30, Margaret had been somewhat normal, and it wasn't until her father died and her mother got a new boyfriend that she became more active in her religious views, attending fundamentalist prayer meetings, which for me it's code for a cult, and insisting to her mother that she and her boyfriend were living in sin. After marrying Ralph, due to what her mother believed had been a pregnancy that ended in a miscarriage and that we get confirmed later in the book, Margaret insisted that she and her husband lived without the curse of intercourse, which of course shows how much Margaret hated everything that reminded her that she was human. And yet, even after she claimed on a letter to her mother that she and Ralph were celibate, Carrie was born. And one has to ask, how was she conceived? Because that can explain a lot of Margaret's most horrible actions, while, again, not justifying them. As I keep pointing out, and I will keep pointing out, Margaret has no justifications or excuses, only explanations, that in the end are only good enough to, explain what she did, but never, ever justifying it. Carrie White was a product of marital rape. This is not something that is talked much about, because the role of Ralph White is very changed in the adaptations, where he is either alive and left Margaret due to her religious madness, or simply never mentioned. Even in the book, he is rarely mentioned, and we never know if he was as crazy as she was. And Margaret felt so guilty that she liked it, her words, not mine, page 2026 of the EPUB version, that she almost killed herself out of guilt due to the sin she felt she had committed. Then Ralph died, and that made her even more adamant that it was all a punishment for her sinning, because in her raped religious view, the only way to clean sin is with blood and death. And yes, she was not blaming Ralph, she was blaming herself. When she realized that she was, in fact, pregnant, She was ready to kill the baby as soon as she was born, but was weak and backslid. This is when I say, yeah, Margaret loved Carrie, because it means that Margaret, evil and crazy as she was unable to kill her own newborn and innocent daughter, even as convinced as she was that Carrie was meant to be sacrificed to God, like Abraham had to his son. Her words, not mine. Unlike everyone in the book, Margaret was also aware of Carrie's abilities long before Carrie herself. She called them the devil's power, because of course to Margaret everything that was not in the Bible, and some of the things that were in the Bible, were the devil's. But she had seen it before Carrie, in her own grandmother, who, according to Margaret, would cackle crazily and droll and make the sign of the evil eye around her when she lighted the fireplace without even stirring from her rocker by the window, making her a witch into Margaret's eyes. Gram, as Margaret calls her, because once again, even in her religious frenzy, it seemed that the woman had some love for her grandmother, died when Carrie was a year old. Which was the second time when Margaret tried to kill Carrie. Because when she came back from the funeral of her grandmother and saw the baby watching a bottle that was dangling in thin air over her head, well, she went to get the knife. However, was stopped by Ralph, who happened to be dead by then. But this just adds to Margaret's insanity, given that it is told in her point of view. Although, of course, it's just an editing mistake of the parts that were added to Carrie at the end. The third time wasn't the charm, except that this time, when she tried to kill Carrie, the little girl being just 3 years old and having seen the neighbor's kid in a bikini in a sinful way, according to Margaret, Carrie defended herself by making stones rain into the house. But yet, one can't help but remember that before the prom, before deciding to try one last time to kill Carrie, Margaret had begged her daughter not to go and repent, to pray and get forgiveness so she wouldn't go to hell and Margaret wouldn't have to kill her own daughter. As I said, in her own twisted way, Margaret loved Carrie. Because the real villain of this piece is not Margaret herself, but Margaret's horrible, twisted, fundamental beliefs. This is, of course, a common subject in King's books, where those who let religion dictate their morals completely are, at best, easily fooled, and at worst, horrible people like Margaret, who, of course, end up stabbing her own daughter before Carrie kills her in the most merciful of ways, a heart attack. The worst tragedy of this all was that, yes, Carrie hated Margaret and wanted to be free of her, but she also loved her mama because she was the only love, twisted as it was, that she had ever known. All of this is to say one important thing. As much as nothing of Margaret's past justified what she did to Carrie, what she did to herself, because Margaret was also prone to self-harm when in a religious frenzy, it also makes her a person, and not a monster. We use the word monster way too often to describe those who do actions that we can't explain, that we want to believe no one, no human, would do, especially to a child of their own, or not, because the child is innocent. But I believe that it's worse when we treat them as humans, because a monster can't help itself. A monster is a beast, an animal who is ruled by instincts and nothing more. A human, a rational being, knows better, could do better. And some choose not to, both in fiction and in reality. That is the real power of the devil, if you ask me. I hope you enjoyed this little change of pace and this deeper dive into Margaret White and the root of her evil actions. I insist, I think what makes this even worse is that she was convinced that she was not evil, that she believed that she was saving Carrie's soul, that she somehow loved Carrie enough to fight her madness for a bit, but ended up losing that fight. And once again, I strongly recommend you to listen to the musical, because the few songs sung by Margaret put more emphasis on her complicated feelings for her daughter. And because she lost the fight, well, no matter what little, and I mean really little, good she had in her soul? She will forever be remembered as the most evil mom in King's World, if not in fiction in general, and be well deserving of that title. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica and Ellie Riley, as well as my first supporters Tania Pineda and Amy Song, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos will not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/AdalisaZ, with a link on the description, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or if you prefer a one-offer, at Coffee with just one donation of $3 you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks and suggestions in the comments below. And well, now it's time to get back to the original road and Baked Maine, to Darkscore Lake finally, where we still have a date with Sarah Loves and her bag of bones.